I think the first big course that you came out with was CSS for JavaScript developers. So what inspired you to write that course, and maybe like what was one of the harder examples that you spent a lot of time like perfecting on in the course?
So I wanted to make that course because I had worked, from maybe like 2016 or so, I mostly worked in front end, mostly worked with JavaScript frameworks, like first with Backbone, if anyone remembers Backbone, a little bit of Ember, a little bit of Angular, and then React, where I've spent quite a few years now. And I knew so many people who would probably describe themselves as JavaScript developers, right? Front end developers who really lean into like the back of the front end, as they say, like the more the framework stuff rather than the UI stuff. Uh, and so many people in this category have a pretty good level of understanding with JavaScript, a pretty good level of understanding of HTML. And then there's CSS, which is like their Achilles heel, right? It's the thing that always ruins their afternoon because it behaves unpredictably. And it's not surprising to me. Like I was in this boat myself where I never learned CSS. Like very few people, when I taught at the boot camp, you have this 12-week program. 11 of the 12 weeks are JavaScript, and that week one is a whole bunch of different things. You have maybe an afternoon of CSS. And when I was trying to figure out what I wanted my first course to be, because I had like 5 or 6 different things I could cover, it occurred to me that CSS was the thing where I thought with a pretty small chunk of time, like 10, 15, 20, 30 hours, I could really get someone from like a pretty beginner level to pretty competent. I mean, CSS does take a very long time to get like expert level. It is a very deep language, but it's so many people are struggle with it so much and have such like a lack of understanding because they've never spent the time, that I thought in a pretty small amount of time I could really help solve a lot of these problems. In terms of like what was the most challenging part, something I wish I had realized when I was starting the course was, and I kind of figured this out from chatting with people and from trying a couple of different structures. A lot of people approach CSS from the properties. Like you think, okay, I'm going to learn what the color property does and what the display property does and what the background color property does. And if I can just learn all the properties, I'll know the language. When really, I think a better way to look at it is that CSS is this constellation of mini languages, and they're called layout modes. I prefer to think of them as layout algorithms. I think that makes more sense for JavaScript-minded people. Then you have Flexbox, right? That's its own little world within CSS. And you have Grid. You have Flow Layout, which we don't normally name, but that's the default if you're not using one of these other ones. There's Positioned Layout. There's all these different things, all these different systems. And the CSS that we write, so like when I write width 100 pixels, that property is going to be passed in as an input to this layout mode. And that layout mode decides what to do with it. Like Flexbox treats width differently than Flow Layout does. And this core part of how CSS works is responsible for so much of the misunderstanding, because like I think we've all had the experience of like you have your little go-to snippet, right? The snippet you've used over and over again. It's worked for you the past 99 times. You use it today and you get something different. Like the UI does not look like what you expect it to look like. And this is what makes CSS feel really sort of unpredictable. But it almost all, or not all, it often has to do with this discrepancy between what we think we're doing, which is passing it a bunch of properties, and what's actually happening, which is the language is figuring out which of these layout modes to use, feeding those properties through as inputs, like as arguments to that function, and using that to decide what the UI should be. And so this is sort of how I've structured the course, but it took me a while to figure out that like, oh, this is actually the core idea that the course should be built around rather than a thing that we sort of visit here and there.
Yeah, CSS is the one subject where I feel like I am an expert, but there's other people I can look to in the field and go, oh, there's much, much more for me to learn. And I think where my expertise is in those layout modes, but as you said, there's like such breadth and like creativity you can have in that breadth.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's I've had the pleasure of speaking at conferences like CSS Day. And when I go there, I realize that like, oh, I don't actually know anything. Because, I'll be chatting with people like Miriam, Suzanne, who came up with a specification for container queries and all that stuff. Rachel Andrew is another person that, they understand things so much deeper than I ever could. So it's the rabbit hole goes deep. Like there's many layers of understanding. And, I've been chugging along now for quite a while. I think I understand it pretty well, but there's always more to learn.
I think some of the reputation that CSS has is from kind of how it used to be to interact with. There were a lot of limitations, and CSS has evolved a lot, especially over the last several years. I mean, because previously, just to do things like if we go way back when people were doing table layouts, is like making a rounded corner was an
Right.
ordeal,
Yeah.
right? We are definitely not in those days anymore. So it sort of begs the question of the recent developments in CSS. What feature has been your favorite?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do like, as a very quick aside, I think part of why CSS is set up the way that it is and why we have this whole system of a bunch of languages within CSS is because we started in one place and it's been 25, 30 years since then. And we can't remove anything because if we were to remove things, we would break websites that were built in 1999. So we have to keep bolting new things on. And that's what sort of gives it the sense that it's this enormous thing with 45 ways to do anything. But that's how it has to be because it's important to have backwards compatibility. Favorite new CSS feature would have to either be container queries, which took me a while to like really get the hang of using them, but now I find that they're totally indispensable. And the has pseudo-class, so :has, which honestly, as someone who mostly works with JavaScript frameworks, initially I had thought that it wasn't really that relevant for me because I don't write a lot of complex selectors. I sort of I rely mainly on I have a class that applies to this element. I have a component that has a collection of classes. So I didn't imagine myself writing these selectors where you have like some high level thing with has and then some low level thing or some much more deeply nested thing. But what I found is it's incredible for matching other states. So if you want let's say you have a form, right? That form has a couple of inputs in it. If you want to apply styling to the form, if one of the inputs is invalid, you can do that, right? You can say form has input : invalid. Or if you want to have something on the form when the user hovers on one of the inputs, right? There's all these interesting relationships that you can do it with JavaScript, but it feels so nice to be able to do that with CSS now. So that's definitely been the most surprising in terms of new features I didn't really think would offer that much to me, but have, again, become a totally... I can't imagine going back to not having it now that I've gotten used to it.
Yeah, those two features in particular were like my wish list features forever because I always found that like, oh, I need a little bit of has, or media queries don't just cut it. Every post by Nicole Sullivan on the Chrome dev team, she'd be like, what features do you want? Every time I was container queries. And now they're doing masonry layout. It's kind of amazing the things that we're getting in modern CSS right now.